ADM, or the Architecture Development Method. ADM is the core of TOGAF. It uses a step-by-step approach to create a method for developing enterprise architecture. It's important to note that the ADM is an iterative process, not only as a whole process, but between phases and across phases as well. So each iteration leads to new decisions and around enterprise coverage, the level of detail that you need to go to, the time horizon, how long are you going to carry on this process, and the decisions may be based on competence and resource availability, and what is the value which is being accrued to the enterprise. One thing very important to note is that every phase is validated against and validates the current requirements of the business, and that's the reason why requirements management is at the middle. So first is the preliminary phase, and this phase includes the preparation and initiation of activities to create the architecture capability. We have to understand the business environment and get a high-level management commitment. We must have an agreement on scope, and what we do is to establish the enterprise principles, establish the governance structure, and of course, do a little bit of customization of TOGAF, because TOGAF is just a framework. You may or may not have all the steps of TOGAF when you actually implement it. Phase A is the first iteration, and it sets scope, constraints, and expectations. It is required at start of every architecture cycle. This is also one of the questions which comes up. Create the architecture vision here and validate the business context and create a statement of work. So statement of work is one of the deliverables which comes out. Phase B is the business architecture, and it shows how the organization meets its business goals and objectives. So what you have in this is the organization structure, goals and objectives, the functions, the services, the processes, the roles, and correlation to organization and functions. We will not go into too much of detail, but it is here that we select the reference model, viewpoints and tools, and do baseline architecture, target architecture, do gap analysis, and define candidate roadmaps and all, which is in fact common across B, C, and D, but I won't go into too much of detail here because of lack of time. Phase C is information systems architecture. It can be broken down into two parts. I'll come to that later when I show you the architecture partitions. But essentially what it has is data and application architecture. This phase shows how the IT systems meet the business goals of the enterprise. So notice the word IT. It is here that we start looking at IT. And also one more thing, that it may be developed either in order or in parallel. Theory suggests that data architecture should come first, but practically it may happen the other way around as well. So just remember that. Phase D is technology architecture. A lot of people who think about architecture think only about technology architecture. They talk about what are the infrastructure requirements and what systems do we require and all those sort of things. But in fact, architecture is much bigger than that. So when you are doing technology architecture, you look at hardware, software, and comms technology, their relationship to each other and to the environment, and the principles governing its design and evolution. Phase E is very important, and it's to perform initial implementation planning to identify major implementation projects. And we decide on the approach as well. So for example, you may have develop versus buy versus reuse and outsource things, or you can have commercial off the shelf products which are called COTS, whether you want to go with open source or closed source, and you assess all the priorities and identify any dependencies. Phase F is migration planning, and you perform the cost-benefit analysis and the risk analysis and finalize a detailed implementation and migration plan. Phase G provides architectural oversight for the implementation. It defines the architecture constraints on implementation projects, and of course there is a governance and management of an architecture contract, which is another very important aspect of TOGAF. This is the phase which actually ensures the business value realization. Phase H is the architecture change management and provides continual monitoring and change management process. This ensures that the changes to the architecture are managed in a cohesive and architected manner. It establishes and supports the enterprise architecture to provide flexibility to evolve, and there will be changes to technology, changes to the business environment, changes to the business structure, and this allows you to provide that flexibility. It manages the business and capacity by monitoring them and the requirements that are changing. So that is all about the core concepts of ADM. This is a very, very high-level view of how things relate to each other. So you are getting the organization committed and involved, and then you're getting the architecture right in the various phases, and then you're making the architecture work and looking at how it best fits, and then you keep the process running and see that everything that happens, any changes to the architecture, are done in a managed and cohesive manner. So ADM iterations, this is what we are talking about. Iterations can happen anytime, anywhere. It can be over the whole process, it can be between phases, or within phases of each iteration. For example, opportunities and solutions in itself may trigger off another ADM iteration. So these are the 4 architecture domains in TOGAF. They are known by an acronym which is BDAT, which stands for Business Architecture, Data Architecture, Application Architecture, and Technology Architecture. And very loosely I have depicted them as layers. They're not so, they are not layered like that. They might have some very, good connections and connectivity. Next is the guidelines. So the TOGAF provides guidelines, and they say that you should apply iteration to the ADM, and you should apply iteration at different level of the enterprise. And there is security architecture in the ADM, which should be considered as well, especially in today's world. Using TOGAF to define governance, SOA. SOA is service-oriented architecture. It's a big topic in its own right, and unfortunately I can't discuss it at the moment, but what it talks about is essentially small services working collaboratively to achieve a business process outcome. There's some techniques which have been provided by TOGAF. I'll just read them out. Their architecture principles, stakeholder management, architecture patterns, business scenarios, gaps analysis, migration planning techniques, interoperability requirements, BTRA, which is Business Transformation Readiness Assessment, risk management, and capability-based planning. So in the architecture context framework, it talks about what should be the architecture deliverables. So when we talk about deliverables, they are artifacts. Artifacts can be catalogs, matrices, or diagrams. And if you want to remember that, just remember that CMD is command prompt for those people who use the DOS systems. So CMD, catalog, matrices, and diagrams. So what you have is, from the deliverables, you add things to the repository, and also you take out items from the repository to reuse them. So that is the relationship. You create more deliverables which can be in future, become the building blocks, and they are stored in the repository so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you decide to do architecture. Architecture content framework it defines the structure of, what the architecture principles, visions, and requirements are. What are the architecture requirements? What are the business architectures, information systems architecture, technology architecture, and how do you realize the architecture? So as you can see, business architecture has, for example, motivation, which has drivers, goals, objective measures, and in the organization you have org units, where are they located, who are the actors or the people who work on it, and the various roles. There are the business functions, their contracts, their service qualities, service level agreements, their process, events, control, and products, and there are other functions as well. So they are actually some core contents, and there are some extensions. I won't go into that detail in this presentation, but yeah, TOGAF just does provide for some things which must be there when you're defining the architecture content framework, and something, if you are specializing, for example, in the process modeling, then you would look in business architecture, function, process, events, control, products. There are some reference models already provided out of box, which are the TRM, Technical Reference Model, and IIIRM. So the IIIRM is a model of the major component categories for developing, managing, and operating an integrated information architecture. That's what the III stands for. It's Integrated Information Infrastructure Reference Model. TOGAF Enterprise Continuum it classifies the artifacts. It is used for classifying architecture and solution artifacts, both internal and external, of the architecture repository as they evolve from generic foundation architectures to organization-specific architectures. So if you have a programming background, you would understand that you have inheritance and you have generic things, and then there's very specific implementations. So as we move from the left to right, we move from generic to more specific, and this happens both for the architecture as well as for the solution. And I'll show you in the next slide what it looks like. So you have the architecture continuum, which is the foundation architectures, common system architectures, industry architectures, and organization-specific architectures. And then on the bottom you have the solutions continuum, which is foundation solutions, common system solutions, industry solutions, and org-specific solutions. So as you can see, the architecture actually supports the solutions. Architecture is more conceptual, whereas solutions are actual instances of how that solution gets implemented. The TOGAF Enterprise Repository is it holds various things. It provides a reference library, it provides the architecture meta model, it provides the architecture landscape, it provides any standards, which may be business standards, data standards, application standards, technology standards, and also keeps a log on the governance decisions and whether or not you're complying to certain requirements. So you may have a compliance assessment undertaken, and then you also have capability assessments and all those tracking work as well, which ensures that you are on track to achieve what you were mandated. Then, of course, there is the architecture capability as well, which talks about the skills, the organization structure, and the architecture charter. The architecture capability framework provides, it provides the training, skills, knowledge, relationship between the architecture professionals. What are their roles and responsibilities, and how do they participate in project and portfolio governance, and how it affects the business operations. And that will be all for this part. This was a brief introduction to enterprise architecture and TOGAF. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.